What is up, everybody? It is Alex from Heavy New York, calling from the quarantine zone again, and this time we are here with Steve of Bellacore. Thank you so much for being here. It's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Alex. Appreciate it.
Yeah, it's awesome to have you here. Thank you for giving us some new music. We have Coherence coming out October 29th. First question is, the first singles that you released, Hidden Window and Foothold, is that a good representation of what the entirety of Coherence is going to sound like, or is that just scratching the surface of what this album is going to be?
Good question. I think probably a bit of both. I think Coherence has a bit of a mix. So Foothold, I'd say, was a little bit more progressive and heavy, maybe a tiny bit less melodic than the rest of the album, less big leads and sort of twin guitar stuff. The single that's dropping today is probably a really good representation. So we'll be releasing Valence today, and that'll be a good sort of cross-section of the melodic, the sort of riffs we're known for, I guess. But yeah, the album's kind of a good mix of melodic death metal and prog.
Yeah.
Prog.
Yeah. It'll be coming out your today, but my tomorrow.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. But being that it's been a while since your last album, Vessels, this has been a 5-year time lapse, did it just feel like you were picking up where you left off after Vessels, or is this meant to be almost like a new beginning for Bellacore in a way?
Yeah, for us, every time we make an album, it's really just trying to continue the thread and change in small ways and get better in small ways. So I think we'll never make an album that's a gigantic divergence from what we do, where we alienate half of our fan base or anything like that. I think it's trying to, push ourselves a little bit, do things that keep us engaged and excited, but not changing the core elements of what we do. So this album is a natural extension, I would say, of Vessels. In some ways, it's also brought probably some of the ideas and sounds from our, second and third albums as well back a little bit into the mix, where it's quite riff-driven, probably a tiny bit less of a focus on ambience. Vessels was a very ambient album.
Yeah.
So this album is probably a bit of a combination of that plus the riff-heavy nature of Stone's Reach and of Breath and Bone.
Yeah, you know what I called Vessels, actually? And I meant it as a compliment, too, but I called it Bellacore Water Park because it had, like, that black water park effect to it.
Oh, yeah, cool. I like it.
Yeah, maybe do a collaboration with Opeth one day. That would be a great collaboration.
I would not say no to that.
Yeah. And you bring up a good point, too, because I feel like you have the best of both worlds, because I feel like, when you compare the Frail Tide to now, like, I think every fan could appreciate every catalog or every album in the catalog, but I also think that there's stuff off of Stone's Reach or of Breath and Bone or Vessels, etc., where they do kind of, like, stand out in a way.
Yeah, I think for us, the Frail Tide was an album which we were learning the ropes when we made it, and when we look back on it, there's things about it that sort of make us go, oh, geez, like, I can't believe we did that. Stone's Reach of Breath and Bone, I guess we hit our stride in terms of this is what we do, and we have a sound that we think works for us. And then Vessels was probably our biggest attempt at trying to really deliberately do some things differently. So the production was handled differently. We wanted a very organic, sort of spacious mix. And then this album's a bit of a return to, okay, let's roll it all into one package and do what we can with it. So, yeah, it's been a good journey, but the Frail Tide's the one that we think is probably the one that, we were definitely learning the ropes at that point.
Well, isn't that every debut of a band, right?
I'd say so, exactly. And it's not a shocker of an album. It's got some great moments, but it's also got a few things that maybe are raw or rough around the edges.
I heard a quote, I forgot which band said it, but they're saying if you look back at your first album and you wouldn't change a thing on it, you're doing something wrong. So
that's a good one, actually. Yeah, if you're proud of it and you think it's perfect, then what have you been doing these past 10 years, I guess?
Yeah, the only debuts I could think of off the top of my head that did so well were Hybrid Theory and Appetite for Destruction. Aside from that, I can't think of really any other band that really found their roots at the very beginning.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it was their first, but I know that Trivium was another band that very early on, was it their first album that went really big, or?
No. I mean, they didn't really get big till Ascendancy. I mean, Ember to Inferno, I think, is their debut, or maybe an album before that. And they're good, but like when you compare that to Ascendancy or The Crusade, it's not even a question. Like they don't perform stuff off those albums at all anymore. So.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Now, When it comes to entering the studio and getting into that songwriting mode, does it kind of like evolve around a preconceived idea? Being a keyboard player myself, I love to improvise and kind of like see what notes work with what notes. So like, is there a lot of improv involved in songwriting, or do you kind of go into the studio like knowing exactly what you want to do?
Yeah, by the time we get to the studio, we know exactly what the music. I'd say 95% is totally locked in. The song structures are absolutely locked in terms of how long and what riffs and how they connect, and we would have practiced that a lot in the band room for months prior. So once we get to the studio, the things we're probably ad-libbing a little bit are those final touches, the ambient sounds, some effects choices on leads, maybe with vocals. We actually have a bit of fun playing around with how we can make them more interesting, or whispered parts or spoken parts, and that stuff happens a little bit more in the studio. But the structures are all well and truly locked in, because we take a very sort of deliberate approach to the structuring and writing of the songs, and that's one of the reasons it takes a pretty long time for us to make an album. A lot of it's done, we might meet up as a group twice a week for 3 or 4 hours each time and sort of go through a song together and make decisions and overhaul them that way over a period of a couple of years. So by the time we get to the studio, it's pretty much set in stone a lot of the time.
Now, next year, I know we're focusing mainly on new albums and the new album, but next year is going to be the 10-year anniversary of Breath and Bone, which is the album that I discovered Bellacore on, as well as a lot of fans here in North America. If you don't mind me asking, but what was the sort of like, taking back to 2012 in a way, like what was like the sort of mindset with creating Of Breath and Bone, and when you look at Vessels to Coherence now, how it might have differed?
Well, when we made Of Breath and Bone, and we obviously only had 2 albums out, we had never played, we'd only played outside of Australia once in 2010, and we sort of saw ourselves as obviously a very early stage band. We just wanted to make another album that was hopefully as good as Stone's Reach. And I think in many ways it's a very similar approach on that album to Stone's Reach. We did get the album mixed with Jens Bogren, and I think that helped to give it a sound that elevated it slightly or made it more accessible, or something about that mix made it sound appealing to people. And I think that helped it to have the effect it did, maybe in America. So yeah, it was a good thing for us to do. But when we made the album, we certainly weren't seeing it as anything hugely different. It was just another album trying to put it all together the best we could.
Has there ever been a time, because I feel like with this style where you combine elements of, like melodic death metal with some progressive metal and stuff, I've seen a lot of these bands think of concepts, and the music does revolve around a sort of story or concept. Has Bellacore always or ever even taken that approach where you feel like maybe a story or even a lyrical idea can maybe influence the direction of the album as well?
Yeah, it's interesting because, again, on those first 3 albums, we really didn't ever have a conceptual approach to the songwriting. We just wrote songs one by one, and the lyrics came also as discrete things, song by song, they had their own story. Whereas once we did start with Vessels, we had a bit of a plan to try to make a more connected conceptual album. The story was told across the length of those songs in a connected way. And again, on Coherence, there is a theme and there are some concepts, and the stories are loosely connected, not sort of in a linear way, but they are connected in some small way. So I think it's really just been the past 2 albums that we've taken more of a kind of holistic view, whereas the first 3 albums we didn't as much from a lyrical sense.
Do you think for like a listener, and this may be kind of a silly question, but like if a listener really wants to get into the full concept and the full mindset of Bellacore and what you were saying, they should start off with Locus and end with Much More Was Lost? Like, is that like, or are your albums ever what I like to say shuffle friendly?
Yeah, that's correct. I'd say this album, the new one, and Vessels are much better done in a full listen. The big songs on the album can still work as standalone songs, and I think they do. But if you're going to really get the most out of the album, I would say put your headphones on, lie down in the dark, have a good listen from start to finish, and maybe even read the lyrics beforehand. Or I think that's the best way to get the experience. Of Breath and Bone is pretty shuffle friendly. I think it's a bunch of pretty catchy songs that don't need to be played in any order.
Being a keyboard player, do you have a classical background that you apply to your songwriting, or are you completely on the self-taught side?
Yeah, 100% self-taught, and that's true of all of us in the band, really. Like, we rely on our own sort of arcane methods to understand music and talk about music with each other, and we don't use, written notation at all and those sorts of things. It can be a limiting factor for us, but it's also, I think, makes it more enjoyable. Like, I personally enjoy the sense that we're also discovering music as we go, and discovering things that aren't new ideas, but to us they're new ideas. So it's been quite enjoyable. And I actually write a lot of the riffs on a computer program, a very old school computer program called ModPlug, which is not geared to any particular instrument. It's sort of like what they used to use for old retro video games to make their soundtracks.
Wow.
So it's fun for me to do it that way. And then I bring it to the guys if it's one of my riffs, and the challenge for them is, well, how do we play this on guitar? Because often they're not very friendly for a guitarist. So we've always viewed that as a bit of a sort of it might lead to some slightly strange choices melodically, but it probably also is part of why we sound the way we sound.
Do you have like a favorite video game soundtrack? Did you ever take, because that's what inspired me to play piano. I mean, Legend of Zelda is what made me want to sit behind a piano, and I was playing the Song of Healing and Zelda's Lullaby and all that stuff. So do you have a particular favorite video game soundtrack or movie soundtrack?
I actually do. There's a guy called Grant Kirkhope.
I've heard of him.
Yeah, and he used to compose for Rare, a company called Rare. So he made the soundtracks on Nintendo 64 for Banjo-Kazooie, GoldenEye.
I was listening to that soundtrack today. I'm not even exaggerating. The 007 GoldenEye soundtrack. Yeah. I have so many memories with that soundtrack.
Yeah. Same here. Like, I played those games a lot when I was, 15, 16, 14, whatever it was. So I think he's always been someone that I've, looked up to, and I think he's amazing with melody. And obviously melody is a huge thing with Bellacore. If you take out the melody, there's not much left. So yeah, big inspiration.
Yeah. And do you also like have inspiration from like epic composers like Two Steps from Hell or Thomas Bergerson, or like really slow motion, any of those like groups? They make they call it like trailer music in a way, where like they make...
I haven't heard those names before, but I might have to look into them. But I guess if it's symphonic trailer style, it probably isn't as much something that I would listen to as much. I think it depends. Some of those tend to sound a bit samey to me. I do enjoy Hans Zimmer's stuff because it's quite unusual. But that typical trailer sound for a big epic something, sometimes I sort of think they all start to sound a bit the same. But I might have to look into those names you mentioned.
Give it a chance. Give Thomas Bergerson a chance. You may like it. And that's really funny that you say that, because a lot of people would assume with your like melodic and progressive style that like, oh my God, they must be fans of Epica or Camelot or Sonata Arctica or something like that. Mm-hmm. But like a lot of people would characterize you as that. In fact, I disagree with this analogy completely. So this is their words, not mine. But somebody once called you guys the Oceanic Amon Amarth.
Look, I can live with that. I think obviously we don't go with the Viking shtick as much. But, I think I see us as a bit of a combination of, classic era Opeth, classic era In Flames, Agalloch. I think if you bring those three elements together, I think Vessels has actually got quite a few parts that sound like Agalloch, because they're one of my favourite bands. So it's just trying to bring some of those things into one picture that works is probably how I see it.
Yeah. What's your favorite Agalloch album?
It would have to be Ashes Against the Grain.
This is my favorite interview of 2021. A lot of people go with The Mantle. I go with Ashes Against the Grain. Falling Snow, I think, is the best black metal song of all time.
Yeah, when I heard that album, I got pretty obsessed with it. I had discovered them through their earlier two albums, and then had waited for Ashes Against the Grain to come out. And I remember when it came out, I listened to it so much. It would be one of my most listened to albums still, I think.
Yeah. You should look up the black metal band Mol, M-O-L. I think they kind of have that.
M-O-L. I'll write that down.
Yeah, their new album is coming out a week from Friday. So they have some great solos and like that gazy black metal sound. And again, every winter I always play Falling Snow. First blizzard we get in New York, I always play that song first.
Yeah. No, it's a brilliant song. Funnily enough, when I first heard Falling Snow, I was disappointed. I remember I'd waited for the Agalloch album to come out. I heard the song and I wasn't very happy. And then I don't know why. I look back on it now and I'm like, I like this album. I love this song. So it's a funny one, but yeah, they're a great band. Although it's a shame they no longer are a functioning kind of band. But
I
yeah.
know, I know. They're one of Portland's finest, as I call it. And but also like going back to your sound, like I wouldn't just label Bellacore melodic death metal or progressive metal or any of that. In fact, I really think that your music is relatively genreless. And you've obviously mentioned your inspirations, but is it fair to say that maybe everybody in the band also has their own inspirations that are brought to the table in songwriting?
Absolutely. Like when we started, I know Sean, especially as our lead guitarist, Iron Maiden and Metallica, I think was a big thing in his leads, especially early. George has always had a very broad and quite a heavy set of bands he listens to. So he'll come to the table with ideas that are, not at all melodic death metal inspired, often very heavy or very dark. So that probably colours what we do as well. And then John has always been hugely into like melodic, like EDM, electronic sort of stuff. And then Elliot's hugely into progressive, challenging sort of rhythmic stuff as a drummer. So he'll bring in ideas. And if you bring all that together, I think you get quite a wide range of influences.
Yeah, and it almost seems like Australia too has been kind of like a progressive metal hub in a way, with bands like you, with Caligula's Horse, Neobliviscaris, Voyager, who's a fantastic band. Like, is there kind of like maybe like a, for lack of better words, a prog metal scene in Australia? Because Australia, a lot of people now know Australia for like the metalcore scene with Parkway Drive and In Heart's Wake and Polaris and so many other bands, but it almost seems like Australia has like a good handful of bands from every type of genre.
Yes, I agree. I think Australia is, if I had to categorize it, I would just say the diversity of metal and some pretty great bands in all of those subcategories of metal. I think it's impressive because we're not a big population here, but there's definitely some pretty great bands coming out of Australia. And I can't put my finger on a single Australian metal sound. It's way too diverse. So yeah, there's a thrash scene. There's definitely a big prog scene. There's all sorts here. So yeah, it's a good place to be.
Yeah, but I'd imagine too that I've always felt bad for a band from Australia that's just starting, because that has to be like everybody here in New York always complains about like, man, I just want to get out of New York and play somewhere else. I'm like, you're less than 2 miles from New Jersey. Just you can walk there with your guitar. Like, but it's got to be difficult maybe for a band to sort of like cut their teeth there, right?
I think it is. I think there's two reasons as well. Like, if you are an Australian band and you want to even just tour Australia, you really need to get on an aeroplane multiple times, because you hear about people who drive from Melbourne to Perth, but that's like a 5-day drive through desert. Wow. It's not an easy job to drive around Australia and play shows either. We've only got maybe 6 or 7 big cities, and they're spread very, very far apart. So you need to be getting on a plane to do that. And then if you want to travel to Europe or America, then it's a 1-day plane trip that'll be pretty expensive. So I think touring is hard, and that's one of the reasons we've relied a lot on the internet. And we're lucky that things like YouTube, Spotify, MySpace along the journey have actually helped us to find fans, because that has in some ways allowed us to grow a fan base.
You need to write a letter to the Australian government, because you need to get like a festival and make the Heirs Rock a giant stage.
That would be very politically hot topic these days, because they've recently, put some restrictions around what can actually be done at Ayers Rock, and it's a cultural site, and I think people aren't even meant to be going on to Ayers Rock these days. So, but you're right. I mean, Australia also needs more festivals, big metal festivals. I think that there's been a bit of a lack of that in the past few years.
Yeah. Or what about that underground city I heard in Australia? I heard they actually have like a whole city that's underground. You should try to play a show there.
I don't know what that city is. I'll have to look that up.
Yeah, I read about it, just through a Facebook article. But yeah, it's like a whole underground city.
Actually, it does ring a bell. Is it something they're building that's new?
It has
an
to,
old one there?
It has to be new.
Yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't feel comfortable going to an old city that's just built underground if it was dug with like an axe and like a hammer,
I think I saw something like that. I'll have to go back, because I do recall now. It's ringing a bell. Yeah.
And the final question I wanted to ask you is the most difficult question of the whole interview. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right, because it's about songwriting again. How do you know when a song is done?
Ooh, there's two answers to the question. One is when we think that it's not boring, it's engaging from beginning to end, but it's not sort of overwrought, and that is a hard thing. But we usually get there in the end. But the real answer is time. When you run out of time, yeah. I mean, we've always had a pretty flexible approach with the label, and they don't sort of force us to stick to a tight deadline. And we did get some extensions, and we were talking with them throughout the process. But especially once you start recording, once you go into the studio, that's when you have to stop tinkering at some point. So we'll say we've got a song that's like mostly finished. We're going to go and start recording the album now. Once you're in the studio, you start to notice the guy you're working with, the producer or the engineer, their energy will also have an end point.
Yeah, and they're looking at their watch.
The end of the, yeah, and they're like, look, I know these guys are paying me, but I'm really sick of them now. And so eventually we have to say, even though we want to do more, we probably have to stop now. So there's two layers to when a song is finished, and one is just that practical, we have to stop now once you're in the studio.
Well, let me just say that was actually a very good answer. Thank you for not giving me the "you only abandoned the song" answer. I'm getting so sick of getting that answer.
Yeah. No, it's look, there is a point where you have to stop, and there's things I'd like to add or change about Coherence now, but they're small, and I'll have to live with them.
Yeah. Great marketing campaign. Yeah, I'm sure the label will be thrilled by that statement.
I'm sure you can delete that sentence.
Nope, it's staying here. That'll be the headline on Blabbermouth.
Yeah, that's funny.
So before we go, I want to thank you so much for your time today and for such a great conversation. Is there just anything else with Bellacore that you would like to promote? Can you please one day bring Bellacore to the States? We would love to have you here.
Well, the good news is we are currently planning that tour. So we're working with Napalm Events to make sure we can actually get to the US, which will be a great thing for us, a very exciting thing. We've wanted to do it for a long time, so I can't wait to make it happen.
Awesome. And you've played in like Europe before too, right? And
yeah.
Yes.
We've had three short tours of Europe.
Okay.
We've mainly played festivals, and the plan is basically release this album, do an Australian tour, come to the US for the first time, and then come back to Europe. So it'll be a good few years, hopefully, coming up.
Sounds awesome. Well, thank you so much, everybody. We are here with Bellacore. Be sure to check out Coherence, coming out October 29th. Make it the soundtrack to your Halloween weekend. This is Alex from Heavy New York. We'll see you next time.